Okay, welcome. Welcome everyone to the 2025 Ambassador Frank E. Baxter Lecture. Welcome to those of you who are here with us today and all of those joining us online, particularly Ambassador Baxter himself and the Berkeley Liberty Initiative Founders Board, to whom we owe so much in making this a reality. As Dean of the Social Sciences, I'm glad that we have forums like the Baxter Lecture that create the opportunity to listen to one another, to learn from one another, and yes, often to disagree with one another. We can disagree, but we must keep talking for the sake of the academic world, for the sake of society, and frankly, for the sake of the globe. It is that process of the exchange of ideas that animates the teaching in our classrooms and that drives our research forward. It also lies at the heart of democracy as an ideal. We believe that we all benefit from living in a society that allows for the possibility, or in fact embraces the possibility of dissent. As I understand it, it also lies at the heart of Dr. Levin's recent book and lecture today. So I very much look forward to hearing his perspective on how Americans can become more unified. But first, I would like to invite our Chancellor, Lyons, to the podium to speak. In addition to being our first undergraduate alumnus to serve as Chancellor, Chancellor Lyons is also a noted economist, so a social scientist, one of us. Chancellor Lyons has also served as Dean and more than most really deeply appreciates the importance of institutional culture, which is very fitting for the ideas under discussion today and for the BLI more generally. Thank you so much for being here, Rich. The podium is all yours.
Thank you, Raka, and thanks to all of you for being here. This is an exciting event. I've been looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to this whole effort that we are in together. This lecture and its topic couldn't be more timely, couldn't be more important. Quote, can the Constitution unify Americans? End quote. That's what we're here to discuss. And we have Yuval Levin here, who's traveled from DC to provide this talk. And there's so much of what he's written and done in the past that bears our attention. And today we get to talk about and hear about this most recent work. Frank Baxter, Ambassador Frank Baxter, many in the room know him. I got to know him when I was dean at the business school. He came to me and said, we need a speaker series. We need to open things up. We need more viewpoint diversity. He's been saying that for a long time and we'll continue down that road. It was a long-standing commitment to dialogue, and his vision for establishing what was the Baxter Liberty Initiative and has now become even wider, this UC Berkeley Liberty Initiative, and the importance of this lecture within that. I want to thank the founders of the Berkeley Initiative, Berkeley Liberty Initiative, the board, the staff, the involved faculty for the important work of making sure that all these viewpoints are heard, and more broadly, that there's a culture shift on this campus. I think that's part of the goal here, right? And we are doing that work together. We will facilitate an even more constructive collision of ideas on our campus. I also want to mention my own commitment to open dialogue. I think some of you have heard me say that before. Respect for difference and differing views, diversity of perspective, diversity of experience, freedom of speech, which is as deep as it gets here at Berkeley, institutional neutrality. I've said many times very publicly that I'm taking Berkeley in the direction of institutional neutrality. And their importance for higher education. We've all been reading about that. That will come up later. Just one little footnote. I happen to be in Washington, D.C. on Monday of this week at an AAU meeting. That's the Association of American Universities, the top roughly 70 research universities in the U.S. And the presidents and chancellors are almost all there, not every single one of them. But here's the footnote. The phrase academic freedom. I mean, to those of us in the room who are academics, it's like, got it. I know exactly what that means. You say academic freedom to somebody who's not in the academy, and it sounds like no accountability. Anything goes in the classroom. Stuff that's happening in these universities, it just let it rip. It's not a very helpful word. And yet we keep saying we're going to defend academic freedom. It's like it's not heard in a productive way by the people we're trying to talk to. We need to speak into their listening. What is academic freedom? It's freedom It's freedom to speak, freedom to learn, and freedom to discover. Every time you hear me refer or see me in writing referring to academic freedom, I'm going to be talking about freedom to speak, to learn, and to discover, because that's the essence. So this is just, it might sound like a linguistic footnote, but I think we need to connect with people in a different way. I want to invite our own Professor Sean Gailmard, Faculty Director of the Berkeley Liberty Initiative and the Herman Royer Professor of Political Economy, to the stage to introduce the speaker. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Chancellor Lyons and Dean Ray. I want to underscore the Chancellor's and Dean's thanks to Ambassador Frank Baxter. Frank, we miss you. We're delighted you could watch on Zoom. And to our entire Berkeley Liberty Initiative Founders Board, including our chair, Peter Desforges. I've attended these lectures for years, and I've appreciated how they broaden the perspective of our campus community. So when I was asked to consider serving as the faculty director of the Berkeley Liberty Initiative, I seized the opportunity. That was just last summer. Since then, we have added core programs to this lecture that bring the BLI into classrooms and seminar rooms where students and faculty live their academic lives at Cal. To use one example, this semester we began our Open Exchange Grants program, which collaborates with faculty on campus who want to develop their students' ability to engage each other across controversial divides. Berkeley needs the BLI because the world into which we send our students does not enforce agreement on established orthodoxies. Our students will constantly interact with people who hold very different views from them as neighbors, as friends and coworkers, as members of our polity. We here on campus must equip our students to expertly navigate a world of differences and to thrive in it. That is a core objective of the BLI. The objective goes beyond students and extends to us faculty as well. We are better for engagement with views that challenge our own positions. This challenge is sincerely supported by my colleagues across Berkeley. I see this routinely in my role as chair of the UC System-Wide Committee on Academic Freedom. But renewal of the commitment to challenge our orthodoxies and exchange constructively across differences can only do us good. That commitment is built into the Baxter Lecture, launched nearly 15 years ago in the hope that it would, and I'm quoting from the original 2011 document, enhance the diversity of voices heard on the University of California, Berkeley campus. It is that vision that animates the Berkeley Liberty Initiative today and gives it such potential as an energizing force for our campus community. Thank you all for being here to participate in that. And many thanks in particular to our speaker today, Dr. Yuval Levin, whom I have the honor of introducing to you. Dr. Levin will talk to us today about the U.S. Constitution's ability to unify people with a wide range of diverse views. Dr. Levin is the director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. He is the author of numerous books, including most recently American Covenant. He is the founder and editor of National Affairs, contributing editor at the National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. Dr. Levin served as a member of the White House domestic policy staff under President George W. Bush and a congressional staffer at the member, committee, and leadership levels. He holds an MA and a PhD from the University of Chicago Committee on Social Thought. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Levin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate that. And my thanks to the Chancellor and the Dean and to all of you for inviting me here on this beautiful spring day. We don't really have a lot of days like this in Washington, so it's a real thrill. And for taking this set of issues as seriously as you do. I'm really grateful to what the Berkeley Liberty Initiative does. I think it's essential. It's necessary on every campus. It's wonderful to see it here, where the idea of freedom of expression as a campus as a campus principle really began. And at a time when that ideal needs to be rediscovered everywhere, I'm glad to see it being recovered here. And the subject that I want to take up is really right on the same set of issues that we've just heard raised by every one of the people we've just heard from. It's really about how a diverse society can hold together and govern itself. And I want to take up what may seem like a peculiar sort of angle on that subject and suggest to you that we should think about the American Constitution as a framework for national unity. I say it may seem strange to think so because unity and cohesion are not normally how we think about what the American Constitution is for, but also because we're living in an intensely divided time, and it can certainly seem like the Constitution is more of a source of that division than it is a solution to it. For both those reasons, we tend to associate the American Constitution with the problems of this moment. And there are voices on both the left and the right now who see the Constitution fundamentally as an obstacle to a functional politics in a divided time. And I think they're mistaken. I want to suggest to you that becoming reacquainted with the U.S. Constitution through the lens of national unity is an essential first step toward taking on the problems we face now, toward understanding this moment and understanding our history in ways that could prove to be genuinely constructive. Seeing the Constitution through that lens of cohesion and unity can help us to see what the stakes are in this moment, what we stand to gain by recovering the aims and forms of the American Constitution, and what we stand to lose by neglecting our Constitution, by showing contempt for it, as we have done too often lately. I think we're used to thinking that what we stand to lose is something like the rule of law, so that the alternative to constitutionalism is something like authoritarianism. And of course, there is some truth to that. If we truly test the boundaries of our politics, if we genuinely turn against our system with brute force, that is not as unimaginable as it used to be, unfortunately. And so we have to take it seriously as a real concern. But it's still not, I think, the first thing we stand to lose by treating our Constitution with neglect or with contempt. The first thing we stand to lose is our capacity for cohesion, for accommodation, for coalition building, our capacity for unity in the face of our differences. And that's not a prospective danger, but a present reality of 21st century America. We have already been losing that capacity in our increasingly polarized and embittered politics for decades. And I want to suggest to you that an important part of the reason why is our neglect of the Constitution and our rejection of some of its core premises and purposes. And to see that, we should consider how the Constitution approaches the challenge of unity. That challenge was very much on the minds of the authors and framers of the Constitution. It's the first goal put forward in the preamble, to form a more perfect union. It's the explicit subject of the first third or so of the Federalist Papers, an implicit subject of the rest of them. It was constantly on the agenda of the Constitutional Convention. Unity is obviously not the only purpose of the Constitution, and the preamble goes on to list a series of other very complicated and ambitious aims, but it is a crucial purpose of it. And so the Constitution is, in some essential ways, an answer to the very question that we now constantly find ourselves asking: how can a vast, diverse society hold together and govern itself? Now, if that's right, if this is a core purpose of the Constitution, it would certainly suggest that our era of division is also, in some way, an era of constitutional failure. But it should force us to ask how much of that failure is a failure of constitutional practice and how much of it is a failure of constitutional design. And therefore, whether a renewal of our politics, a restoration of some of our national cohesion might require us to learn something from the Constitution, as well as to learn about how we might do things differently. It should lead us to consider whether there are ways in which the Constitution might be more like the solution than the problem in this moment. To see the Constitution through the lens of the challenge of unity would help us to grasp some very important things about it that are not otherwise obvious, and to understand some facets of our contemporary national challenges that are not obvious either. It might even point to some ways forward. And so let me sketch very briefly what it might involve to think about the Constitution through this lens of unity. First of all, to see that the Constitution is concerned with unity and with cohesion is to take notice of a distinct understanding of unity that would be very useful to us now. It's an idea that's particularly evident in the thinking of James Madison, who was uniquely attuned to the dangers of division and faction. Madison is different from the other framers. He doesn't fall neatly into any of the familiar categories of left and right that we might have now. And he wasn't a lawyer. Of the prominent framers, he was almost the only one who wasn't a lawyer. And he thought about the challenge they confronted less as a legal challenge and more as a fundamentally political challenge. His approach to the question of unity starts from what might seem at first like a contradiction in some of his thinking. On the one hand, Madison insists that disagreement about fundamental questions is inherent and unavoidable in a truly free society. He puts this very bluntly. In Federalist 10, he writes, quote, "As long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed." Period. In other words, differences are a function of freedom itself. And we all know this. Any experience you've had with any group of people of any size, if you let them speak their mind, they will disagree with each other. That is a fact. So that the kind of idea of unity that's very often now implicit in the rhetoric of our politicians isn't really realistic. That idea of unity says, if everybody agreed with me, this country would be great. And sure, I think that too. If everybody agreed with me, this country would be great. But that is not an option. And given the reality that it is not an option, we have to ask ourselves, how still can this country be great? Even as he stresses this point, Madison, in the very next Federalist that he wrote, Federalist 14, insists that Americans not lose hope about unity and not accept the notion that they cannot live as one society. Hearken not, he says, to the unnatural voice which tells you that the people of America, knit together as they are by so many cords of affection, can no longer live together as members of the same family. So Americans will never stop disagreeing, but should never give up on living as one nation. Unity is achievable as long as we don't expect it to mean unanimity. So then what should we expect it to mean? Embedded in the Constitution is a classical approach to this crucial question, a kind of Aristotelian answer that looks to politics as an arena for coming to agreement about common action. Simply put, in a free and therefore diverse society, unity doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. Thinking alike and acting together are very different, and the differences between them are very important for us to understand in our moment. Now, this is not to say that citizens start out with no common foundation or no shared beliefs. Americans are not strangers to each other, and we have some basic principles in common, especially the principles that are laid out in the Declaration of Independence. But although those widely accepted principles impose some general moral boundaries on American political life, there's enormous room for disagreement within those boundaries, even about those boundaries. Our politics is unavoidably organized around those disagreements and requires us to find ways to act together without fully resolving our differences. But that's a formulation that invites, I think, an obvious question. How? How can we act together when we don't think alike? I would suggest to you that the United States Constitution is intended to be a set of answers to that question. How can we act together when we don't think alike? Almost everything that is mysterious and frustrating to many Americans now about our system of government is a function of its being an answer to that question. And a lot of the dysfunction of our contemporary political culture is a consequence of failures of constitutional practice that stand in the way of putting the Constitution's particular answer to that question into effect. That answer is not simple-minded. There are simple-minded ways to answer that question. You can say, we act together when we don't think alike by just taking a vote and seeing what the majority wants to do. But that kind of answer would endanger minorities in a free society. And precisely because we do agree that we are all created equal, and because we've lived a national history that too often has trampled over that truth, Americans know that although majority rule is an absolutely essential principle of legitimacy, it also can sometimes be a principle of despotism, of oppression. And so our Constitution looks to help us act together when we don't think alike, while also balancing majority rule and minority rights. That is not a simple task. And so ours is not a simple system of government. It looks to broaden majorities before empowering them, and to restrain majorities even while ultimately relying on them. It deals with tensions like this, even contradictions, by seeking a kind of dynamic balance between competing pressures over and over. This is its strength, but it's also why the Constitution is so frustrating to us so much of the time. Acting together when we don't think alike requires creating some space for competing approaches to coexist. It requires compelling opposing factions to bargain and negotiate and seek accommodations. It requires administering the government in steady and predictable ways in accordance with those accommodations. And it requires enforcing clear boundaries on the powers of majorities and of public officials. That is the work of federalism, of Congress, of the president, and of the courts, respectively. And it requires a citizenry well formed in some core Republican virtues by the very experience of acting together when we don't think alike. Looking at the parts of the Constitution through the lens of that distinct understanding of unity can help us to see each of those parts in a different light than we usually do. And let me quickly suggest to you what that can look like in the case of each of these institutions. To begin with, it can offer us a way to avoid a common misunderstanding of American federalism. We tend to view federalism now through the lens of decentralization or subsidiarity, and so we think of the states and the national government as layered over each other, and we think federalism encourages us to emphasize the lower layers, the state and local layers. That's a way of thinking about federalism that's very convenient to communitarianism. I certainly resort to this way of talking myself sometimes, but it's not quite right as a way of understanding our system. It would be better to think of federalism as describing parallel governments, not layered ones, and the imperative of unity is a key reason why. Federalism is intended in part to reduce the number and scope of political controversies that have to be resolved uniformly at the national level. It emerged as a compromise at the Constitutional Convention between partisans of a centralized national state and champions of a decentralized confederation. Their dispute ultimately came down to a single core question. Would the national government govern the people directly, with the states serving as administrative districts, the way counties work in most states? Or would the national government govern only the states in a few discrete areas, while the state governments would govern the people directly? Unable to agree on either of these approaches, the convention worked its way toward a novel idea. The state governments and the national government would both govern the people directly, but with regard to different subjects. They explicitly rejected a layered approach in favor of a parallel approach. Broadly speaking, the federal government would govern the economy and diplomacy and defense, which may sound like a short list, but encompasses quite a lot, especially given the scope of economics. And the states would continue to govern everything else, including deploying the core police powers that are most of what government does. This peculiar kind of compound republic, as James Madison called it, can let our national politics specialize in national challenges where we can't avoid the need to decide on one course of action, while state governments can focus on things nearer at hand in their different ways. It allows for a diversity of governing approaches to coexist at once, even to compete, without having to be resolved into a single national approach in most cases. Now, this has never been a simple matter, and in particular, the decision to leave the question of slavery and race to the states proved to be both wrong and untenable, to put it mildly, and ultimately had to be reversed on the battlefield for the sake of both justice and union. The 14th Amendment added the imperative to apply the laws equally to all citizens, to the federal government's relatively limited set of responsibilities, a necessary rebalancing of federalism. And of course, in practice, that has not been simple either, and has taken a very long time to put into effect. But with regard to many other contentious, if less existential kinds of questions, a separation of governing authorities has offered and still can offer a practical means of allowing Americans to live with our diversity while still forging a cohesive national identity. Seen through this lens of unity, what matters most about federalism is this separation of governing authorities, which allows for some genuine diversity in the ends and the means of American government. It may be that we now may have to broaden again the list of issues that belong in the federal purview, but it's crucial that we not combine state and federal authority over these kinds of issues and just use the states as if they were administrators of federal programs, as we've done too often in education and in healthcare, in welfare and elsewhere, to the detriment of our constitutional system and especially of its ability to keep us together. Constructive reforms of American federalism would need to untangle our parallel governments some, not to layer them over each other even more. Now, those questions that do need to be resolved at the national level are intended first and foremost to be addressed by bargaining in Congress, And the purpose of Congress also looks a little different in light of the Constitution's emphasis on national unity. Congress is really at the center of the constitutional system, for good and bad. In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates, Madison wrote. Republican government is representative government. And although the presidency, and to some extent even the courts, are ultimately accountable to the people too, only Congress is designed to be representative of the people. And Congress is, of course, the absolutely central institution in the Constitution's vision of unity too. By representing our plurality, our national legislature can allow for negotiations among the key factions that compose that plurality. This is the first and foremost way, the most important way, in which the Constitution envisions Americans acting together even when we don't think alike, by negotiating toward broadly acceptable courses of action. This is the essence of our politics. When it works, Congress can function as an arena of contention and of coalition building, even of integration, as the representative of different American points of view oppose each other, are compelled to find ways to accommodate each other, and in some respects, come to understand themselves as engaged in a common effort. Madison took this to be maybe the primary advantage of representative government. It can refine and elevate public sentiments and passions and give them forms that are more amenable to being negotiated so that they can be turned into coherent governing objectives. This is a key reason why Congress is not simply majoritarian. The U.S. Congress is different from the kinds of parliaments that you find in most other democracies now, because it doesn't empower simple majorities to govern unrestrained until they lose their mandates. The distinct overlapping electorates that choose the House and Senate, the constant threat of presidential vetoes, the assorted supermajority requirements that exist here and there, all mean that narrow, ephemeral majorities can't exercise real power in the American system. They have to deal with broad and durable minorities. They have to work to build some consensus before they can really exercise institutional power. This is done in part to protect minorities, but also to build consensus that reaches further than simple majority power, to make us more unified before we act. It's critical to see that that kind of coalition building doesn't feel unifying as it's happening. Negotiating processes are inherently adversarial, but by compelling different factions to deal with each other with the aim of concrete common action, those sorts of processes can forge some common ground. An effective legislative accommodation doesn't just give each side half a loaf. It gives everybody some practical experience in living and acting together. It builds cohesion, it builds social capital. And as much as it is a source of public policy, Congress is a source of this kind of accommodation, an arena for working out differences in ways that can disarm dangerous divisions. Needless to say, that is not what Congress generally looks like right now. And so it's not what our political culture looks like. There have been some instances in recent years of genuine cross-partisan bargaining on some key issues, especially thanks to the filibuster in the Senate, which has been absolutely essential in facilitating unity in our system. But it's been all too rare, and much of the time, the institution is dominated instead by culture war theatrics and partisan grandstanding on all sides. That Congress is broken is the primary reason why our political culture is broken. But seeing exactly what it is that's broken is crucial. When reformers think about how Congress needs to change, they too often overlook what it's actually failing to do. Everybody agrees that Congress is broken. It would be hard to find someone who thinks it isn't. But what is its dysfunction? What function is it not performing? The natural, intuitive answer to that question is Congress is not passing big legislation. Pick your favorite issue, Congress isn't fixing it. And that's true on the budget, on the environment, on immigration, whatever it is that you think matters most and is most urgent, Congress is failing to pass big legislation. But there's an underlying problem underneath that. Congress is failing to facilitate cross-partisan bargaining and accommodation. That is its purpose. That's why it's not passing big legislation. But to see that that's the underlying problem is very important, because the difference in how we interpret the nature of the problem determines a difference in how we prescribe solutions. If the problem is that Congress isn't passing major legislation, then you want Congress to be more efficient. You want it to move more quickly. Maybe you want to empower the leaders of both houses to centralize power more, let things move more quickly. Maybe you want to get rid of the filibuster. If you think the problem is that Congress is not facilitating bargaining across party lines, then you actually want Congress to be less efficient. You want to force the two sides to deal with each other. You love the filibuster, as I do. It's the only reason we've had any bipartisan bargaining in the last 15 years in Congress. You don't want to centralize power in leaders. It's already the case that only 5 or 6 people actually do any legislating in Congress right now in most cases. You want to decentralize power, allow the committees to do their work. If you see the problem as a failure to facilitate bargaining, then you see that Congress requires some decentralization of power. That's not the solution that comes naturally these days, but I think it's the solution that is absolutely essential in this moment. Too many well-intentioned proposals for reform of Congress out there now are on the wrong side of this basic distinction. I would put the distinction this way. I think that Congress needs to be reformed in ways that make bargaining across party lines more likely, not less necessary. And most reforms of Congress now look to make it less necessary, to let the narrow majorities we have, and we've had the narrowest majorities in the history of Congress for the last 12 years, to let them act on their own. That is not ultimately a way to solve the actual problem we confront. And seeing that more clearly could help us grasp how improving our practice of constitutionalism could also build more solidarity in American life. Now, the task of turning Congress's negotiated frameworks into actual functional administration falls to the President of the United States, alas. But the President's role in facilitating national unity is also not what it's generally perceived to be. Critics of the Constitution are dissatisfied with how inefficient policymaking by bargaining and accommodation can sometimes look, often look to the President to act more decisively on behalf of the whole nation. Some even insist that because the President is the only official elected by a national constituency, the President is also the figure most representative of the entire American public. The White House staff can be heard saying this regardless of who the President is. They're certainly saying it now. But this is totally at odds with how the framers understood the office of the President, and I think with how we should understand it. The presidency is a unitary institution. It can't be a venue for accommodation and bargaining. It's one person. It's the locus of action that's intended both to execute the laws and to respond to demanding practical challenges on behalf of the nation. The framers generally did not view the presidency as a representative office. The chief executive is elected in order to keep him accountable, but no one person could be representative of an immense, diverse society. To imagine that a single person could hold us together by embodying our unity is to assume away our diversity, to suggest that we're already unified, just not adequately represented. That's what a lot of the Constitution's critics implicitly assume, but I think the opposite is closer to the case. Because we are a diverse society, representing us requires a plural institution. But the President does, among his other important functions, have a distinct and crucial role to play in facilitating national unity. He does this especially by providing a stable backdrop for our national life. Stability, consistency, predictability, what Alexander Hamilton called steady administration. Imagine that, steady administration forms the executive's distinct and crucial contribution to the unity of our society. Stability is absolutely essential to social peace. It's impossible to make plans without it. It's impossible to think about the future without it. Stability is not stasis. It's not staying in place. The president is expected to give a steady direction to our politics, even to some extent to Congress's work, to set some general priorities, to propose some legislative measures, to veto ones that he disapproves of. But in doing all of that, his chief purpose, beyond defending the nation, is to turn Congress's negotiated directives into steady, consistent administrative action. The framers' emphasis on that particular point is really unmistakable, and it's really unfamiliar to us now. It's just not at all how we think about the president's role today. We've come to see the president as the leader of a political party and ultimately as the chief actor in the theater of our politics. And the huge apparatus of agencies that has come to be built up around the president, what's come to be called the administrative state, too often functions now as a kind of substitute legislature that's maybe less slow than Congress, but not less partisan. All of that undermines the work of steady administration and the capacity of the president to provide some unity and civic peace. It means that our elections determine everything. After a presidential election, there's a sudden, sharp shift of direction. And that's exactly what the Constitution tried to avoid. The idea that a newly elected president will spend half his time undoing all of his predecessors' administrative actions, and the other half taking administrative actions that his successor will undo, is not how the presidency is meant to function. And reining in the administrative state is therefore not just a matter of constraining government power. It would offer us a way to recover the capacity of our governing institutions to forge some of the common ground that we lack, the capacity of the presidency to secure a stable backdrop for American public life. The courts, finally, are also essential to making greater unity possible, but again, not quite in the way that we might imagine. The service they provide on that front is not the resolution of disputes in our free society. Obviously, courts do resolve disputes. That's what they do. But they're intended to resolve disputes over what the law is, not what it should be. And so they're not the proper venue for mediating among competing visions of the public good in American life. Our great public disputes over what the law should be resolved through the work of the legislature, above all, and in a very different way than how courts resolve disputes. And what the courts do then is make sure that those negotiated frameworks of law are carried out properly. So the most valuable service that the courts can provide to the cause of national unity is in their policing of the rules and boundaries of constitutionalism. The federal courts have enormous counter-majoritarian power, which makes them inherently dangerous to a democratic republic. It's absolutely crucial that power like that be used to guard the structure of our system of government, to keep elected officials focused on their proper work. That's a restrained role for the courts and also a restraining role. And it's going to matter enormously in the next few years. Playing that part properly is going to require what Alexander Hamilton, Federalist 78, called an uncommon portion of fortitude in the judges to do their duty as faithful guardians of the Constitution. That assertively restrained role is the role that the conservative judicial revolution of the past generation has insisted that judges should play. The right may well be in the process of forgetting that role and its limits now, but the courts must not forget it. They'll need to be assertively restrained in the coming years if they're going to play the part required of them to sustain the possibility of a unifying constitutionalism in America. The temptation to use the power of the courts to decisively resolve divisive political disputes is, of course, enormous, but it has to be resisted, especially by judges themselves, if the courts are going to be able to play the essential role they now have to play, preventing end runs around our constitutional system, and ultimately making it possible for our system to facilitate the kind of unity that our Constitution envisions, a unity that consists of acting together when we don't think alike, a unity that involves negotiating through our differences, finding accommodations, working our way toward acceptable bargains of public policy in a country as divided and as diverse as ours. I think in thinking about that, there's one final lesson we can draw from the Constitution's peculiar approach to unity that could be very helpful to us now. And it takes seriously some of the criticisms that are offered of our constitutional system. Those critiques are generally arguments for a simpler majoritarianism. They suggest that our system is standing in the way of change the public wants. And so they imply that our divisions in some way are just illusions, that we ultimately are fairly unified, but are denied what we want by a system that is geared to frustrate us. I think there have been times in our history when something like that has been true, when the deliberate recalcitrance of the Constitution has been our major political problem, when large majorities of Americans expressed a clear set of desires for an extended period of time, but were denied what they sought by the rigidity of our system. There have been other times, though, when strife and discord in our society have been our biggest problem, when Americans were bitterly divided and viewed one another more as enemies than friends, and so have been unable to form clear, durable political aspirations beyond getting rid of their opponents. I think that we are plainly living now in one of those latter moments. There is no broad and durable American majority advancing a coherent agenda that's obstructed by our institutions. We live in a 50-50 moment, a very unusually long 50-50 moment in American public life. And what we should seek from our system is not a way to empower our tiny little 49% majorities, but a way to form broader majorities, to build bigger coalitions. That is, in fact, exactly what our Constitution was built to do. And to allow it to function, to put Congress at its center, not the president, to think about its purpose as facilitating negotiation and accommodation, could help us to enable the Constitution to serve its fundamental purpose, could help us to see again what that purpose is and what the potential of our politics is. And so in this moment, the Constitution looks much more like a solution than the problem. This is a moment that tempts us to repudiate our inheritance, but that actually requires us to renew it. Americans are often angry at our Constitution now because we sense that it's broken down. But if we could see that we have broken it, we could see that it needs us if it's going to serve us better. By rising to repair it, we could enable it again to repair our society, to bring us a little closer together, as it was made to do. The work of healing our divisions should start with a reacquaintance with our Constitution. Thanks very much.
The first question, there have been over 12,000 attempts to amend the Constitution since 1788. Why have there only been 27 amendments passed? Is the process working to make government efficient?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's on. The Constitution is, I think, appropriately difficult to amend. The purpose of it is to provide a general framework for American public life, not to settle policy questions. That's done by our politics, by elections, by Congress, by state legislatures, but to establish the structure, the framework of American political life. I think what happens when a constitution is easy to amend is what has happened in most of the states over the last 100 years, where the Constitution, the state constitution, comes to be 150 pages, 300 provisions, specific tax rates are set, specific roles for boards of education. I don't think any of that is necessary in the American Constitution. Now, that's not to say that there aren't changes necessary in the American Constitution. It is to say that those changes should prove themselves necessary by being desired by a broad majority for a long time. There's room to argue about how broad. It's very hard right now to imagine a majority that would consist of 2/3 of both houses of Congress, 3/4 of the state legislatures. But it has happened after moments like this, when it has seemed as though the structure of the Constitution has been what stood in our way. There have been periods of constitutional amendment in our history, followed by long stretches of failed attempts to amend the Constitution. So after the Bill of Rights and the 11th and 12th Amendments, which were sort of jiggering with the structure of the Constitution, you went through a long period, a 50-year period, with no constitutional amendments until after the Civil War. After the Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, you went through an even longer period, 65 years, without any constitutional amendments, and then a series of progressive era amendments. We've now gone through another period of, I would say, 50 years. The 27th Amendment isn't a real amendment. It was sort of done to celebrate the Constitution's birthday, the 200th anniversary. The real last amendment was giving 18-year-olds the vote. That was a long time ago, in the 1970s. But how long ago? About as long ago as these stretches of between constitutional amendments have been. What's happened in those stretches, if you think about the period that precedes the Progressive Era, or of course the period that precedes the Civil War, are periods of breakdown, of dysfunction, that gradually amount to an argument for some specific, discrete set of changes in the Constitution. I don't think we have arrived at that point. I don't think we have a problem to which the solution is clearly a constitutional amendment. I can imagine some amendments that might be helpful. I would, for example, make it unconstitutional for anyone who's ever served in the Senate to run for president. I think it would dramatically improve both the Senate and the presidency. I'm not sure that's going to get a majority in the Senate, but okay. I don't think any change like that at the moment is what's necessary. And I would also say, even if it were a little easier to amend the Constitution, we wouldn't have majorities to do it now. Look, we don't have majorities to do anything now. Our problem in this moment is the absence of durable majorities. What's really distinct about 21st century political life is not polarization, but deadlock, right? We have a two-party system. They're polarized. They hate each other. That's what they do. But they are both at 50% for 25 years is extremely unusual. It is a real breakdown of the American party system. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we get to a place where our party system produces more durable majorities? I don't think a constitutional amendment is a way to do that, because you can't get to a constitutional amendment until you've resolved that problem first. I wouldn't call it naive, because that was the view of the framers of the Constitution. they really hoped that we would not have a party system. They really believed that we might not have a party system. And then the Constitution got started, and within about 5 minutes, those very same people created a party system. And I think there's a reason for that. There's a need that political parties meet in a democracy. They organize the work of democracy majority making in a way that would be very hard to do within the political system. Someone has to choose who will run for office. There has to be an organized way to filter the choices that the public confronts. And in every modern democracy, a party system has arisen to meet that need. The American party system for a long time was able to function as a pretty good fit for the American constitutional system. The evolution of a two-party system, I think, served us well. I think the two-party system still serves us better than a multi-party system probably would. But at this moment, the American party system is not functioning well. There's no way around that. I think the parties have to ask themselves what changes they need to make so that they can do their jobs better. But for that to happen, the parties would first have to recognize that they are currently failing. And the strangest thing about this moment in American political life, about 21st century politics in our society, is that both parties have lost every election for 30 years, and neither of them can see it because the elections have been so close. Right? To win the presidency with 49% of the vote and then say, this is a new mandate, it's a new era, we've won a new American coalition, which is what happened after the last election and after the previous election by both parties. Both presidents came in having won a little tiny majority saying, this is a new era in American life. We keep doing this. And when you do that, you turn off the voters who just barely tolerated you, and then the other guy wins by a little tiny majority, and he does the same thing. There has to be a way out of that dynamic, and that way has to be, first and foremost, seen by the parties as a way to address their own failure. I think they have to rethink the primary system, which is a very bad fit for contemporary American political culture. The primary system is not new, but it's a bad fit for our moment in a way that I think the parties have to recognize. This needs to be a period of experimentation with election reform, party election reform, primary reform. In both parties, they both pay a heavy price for the primary system, which lets their most devoted voters pick their candidates so that their least devoted voters are always unhappy with their candidates. This is not a way for the party system to function. We're basically taking the craziest 10% of the public, asking it, what do you want? And then running the entire system in accordance with that. And I say this as a primary voter, as one of those crazy people. If you think about politics all the time, you're not a normal American. And there has to be a way for our politics to function that serves normal people. So I think party reform is necessary, but I don't think we can get rid of the party system.
Thank you. President Trump has issued more executive orders by far than any other president in history. And he's facing more lawsuits. Is he truly expanding executive power, or do you believe in the long run his actions will end up shrinking executive power?
That's a great question. I would say, so it's true, in these 100 days, which ended yesterday, Donald Trump advanced more administrative actions, executive orders, and similar things than any president in history, including Franklin Roosevelt in his first 100 days, where that term, first 100 days, really came to be. At the same time, in those first 100 days, Donald Trump signed fewer pieces of legislation than any modern president. When you think about effective presidents, about transformative presidents, you think about legislation. You think about the New Deal and the Great Society. You think about the tax reforms of the 80s, the defense buildup. You don't really think about administrative actions. I think that the idea that what we're seeing now is transformational of American government is probably wrong. And that what we're seeing now will prove to be much more ephemeral than it seems. A lot of it has already begun to be reversed or rolled back. A lot of it is less than meets the eye anyway, because what is an executive order? An executive order is a statement by the president to the people who work for him. It's within the law. It cannot create new authorities. Every executive order at the end of it has this weird sentence that after declaring all this stuff, they say this doesn't create any new authorities. Well, they have to say that. That's the structure of our Constitution. And so executive orders are almost inherently less than meets the eye. And we're also seeing the president force some questions that have been left constructively ambiguous for a long time about executive power, force those questions to be resolved in a discrete, concrete way by the courts. He is not going to like the way a lot of those are resolved. The current Supreme Court, in relation to executive power, has to be understood because its view is very complicated. This is a court that believes in the unitary executive, which means the president runs the executive branch. The president is the executive branch. Everybody who works for the executive branch works for the president. So in that sense, they believe in a strong president. It's also a court that's very devoted to the separation of powers and that doesn't believe the president runs our government. The president runs the executive branch, but not our government. We're going to see a lot of questions of executive power in the next few years that will require us to keep that distinction in mind. So that if the question is, can the president hire and fire people? Can the president let some 21-year-old run the Treasury's finance system? Yes, the president can do that. He's the CEO. When the question is, can the president ignore a congressional appropriation? Can the president dismantle a congressionally legislated agency? The answer is going to be no, over and over and over. And ultimately, resolving these ambiguous questions about presidential power could well leave the presidency as an institution weaker and not stronger after this period of intense energy in the executive. I think that's likely where this is going, but obviously it's a fool's errand in this moment to really predict where things are going.
It'll be interesting, particularly given the majority in the court right now, where things end up. This goes back to the last comment that we were talking about. It seems like Congress is so dysfunctional, partly because many of the representatives are afraid to be primaried if they try to work across the aisle. How would you address this? Ranked choice voting?
Yeah, I think it's true. Members are very afraid of being primaried. They shouldn't be. Very, very few members, sitting members, ever lose primaries in either party. But all of them are terrified of being challenged from the more activist wing of their own party. I think the problem this creates, as I suggested before, confronts the party system with a tremendous challenge. And what it requires, in my view, is some experimentation with candidate selection. I think there's room to try ranked choice voting in primaries. Ranked choice voting in general elections doesn't actually strike me as a good idea. I think it weakens the party system in a way that would make our problems worse. But in primaries, ranked choice voting can be very useful. It can allow the party to come closer to its broader electorate rather than to the narrow primary electorate. It's worked in some places in the primaries, in Virginia, to some degree, a mixed degree in Alaska. But I'm not sure that's the solution. And I don't pretend to know the solution. Our system is decentralized in a way that allows for experimentation. And the party system in our history has often been pretty good at experimentation. Primaries, for example, were an idea that was only tried in the South for 120 years in America. It made sense in the South. It didn't make sense in California and Wyoming, so it wasn't done here. Well, now it is. And it's time, again, to try something different, to ask yourself, what do we need where we are? Whether that's in a competitive state, whether that's in a very partisan state, the answer is going to be different. So I think this is a time for experimentation. There's very, very little structural experimentation in American political life now. And I think there's room for a lot more of it.
Okay, this is our last question. The letter signed by over 400 university chancellors and presidents, including our very own Chancellor Lyons, was titled "A Call to Constructive Dialogue." It's interesting because nowhere in the media, by the way, have I seen that title, the constructive dialogue piece of that. So the question is there any hope that constructive dialogue can happen given the polarized world that we're in right now? You can already see people taking camps on both sides of the issues going on in our universities. Is there hope, and where is that hope?
Yeah, well, there's hope, but hope is a start. Hope is not a strategy; it's a disposition. And I think it's the right disposition always toward American government because our system is built to facilitate disagreement, and we certainly have disagreement. I think that the tension now between our leading research universities and the administration is in a place that makes it very difficult for constructive conversation to begin, because there's been a set of actions from the administration that, to my mind, seem frankly illegal. Whatever you think about the universities, and whatever you think about the policy changes the administration is trying to drive, and I think some of them are good, many of them are, the way in which it is being done, by changing the terms of federal grants in retrospect, by making demands that plainly violate the First Amendment, this is not a way to engage in any kind of negotiating process. I think some of that is going to get addressed in the courts. Some of it will happen fairly quickly. And after that, there will be some need for some bargaining and negotiation. Universities in our society play a fantastically important role. They are necessary for the flourishing of our society, but they also have obligations to our society. And they have not always been living up to those. And among those, by the way, is a commitment to free expression, to a diversity of views. I think there is room between the representatives of the American public and the administrators of key American universities to work this out, to negotiate some, to bargain. There's a lot of money on the table, and money can be a way to drive change. That's fine. That's appropriate. But it has to be done in ways that respect the law and that respect the people involved, and that see that everybody's bringing something very significant to the table. This is not simply an adversarial process. This is ultimately a way to try to make our country stronger. I don't think that's been the attitude on either side of the table for a long time. My hope is that what started here, and I use that term hope, that what has started here can lead in the direction over time of some constructive dialogue. It's going to take some less constructive confrontation first, and oftentimes that's just the nature of our system, and we have to see how it pushes this forward.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a great speech. I do want to do a quick pitch for BLI, the Berkeley Liberty Initiative. We are a group of founders, but we're looking for more. Participation on any level is greatly appreciated to fund these type of events. We've got a lot of stuff going on campus to bring diversity of thought onto the UC Berkeley campus, and we love to have more partners involved with that. So if you have any interest in that, Eric is here and can talk to you about what the opportunities are to get involved. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here today.